Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Diary of a Lawyer. And I just want to quickly cover the developing situation in Kenya after the president last month signed a controversial finance bill that introduced new taxes, including levies on fuel and housing, which have now been frozen by the courts. And so, however, Nairobi being the capital of the government, insists that the default is not an option and it rushes to avoid the fate of other countries like Zambia and Ghana regarding the debt payments as protests mount. So, the Financial Times and other media report the story uh, that is regarding the ongoing protests as they amount in the East African country, which they classify as being on a distress risk. The story in the article in the Financial Times starts by describing the union leader Constantine Monsonga, saying that there's a clear reason for the Kenyan state's failure to pay its workers on time because of its 70 billion US dollar total public debt. And he says, they quote him as saying that we're having a crunch time because of the debts that were built up by the previous regime. So the government, whatever they collect now, first they pay the debt and then they collect for salaries, he's quoted as saying. It adds that in addition to delayed delivery of state employee wages for the first time in Kenya, quote unquote, it gained independence from Britain in 1963, according to the quoted opposition lawmaker Opiyo Wandayi. The president has faced mounting criticism for slashing subsidies, implementing austerity measures, and aggressively collecting taxes. The measures are part of the government's bid to find enough cash to meet creditors' demands and avoid the defaults and forced restructurings of other countries such as Zambia and Ghana. Their higher interest rates and a stronger dollar have made financing options more expensive. In addition to the risk presented as a premium for African countries. But the president said that Kenya spends about 10 billion US dollars a year on debt repayments to China and other lenders, and is focused on paying a 2 billion euro bond, US dollar euro bond due next year. And debt servicing costs have jumped from 59.5% of total state revenue in the 2021-22 fiscal year to 63% in 2023 to 2024, which is a daunting prospect. Now, the predecessor to Ruto, Uhuru Kenyatta, apparently borrowed heavily from Beijing and the international financial markets to fund railroad and port projects, according to Financial Times. However, many of those schemes have failed to generate enough income to pay back debts. Around 5.9 billion US dollars of Kenya's 36.6 billion of external debt comes from China, with the rest from domestic or other bilateral and multilateral lenders, as well as Eurobonds, according to March data from the country's treasury. Now, Ruto, who was then the current president, who was then Kenya's deputy president, took office last September, promising to ease the financial burden on Kenyans. As you know, there were protests earlier this year in March that led to a standoff, and then later some kind of understanding, however you want to put it, between the veteran opposition leader Raila Odinga and former Prime Minister and now President William Ruto. But as markets watch how East Africa's economic powerhouse manages repayments in a tougher financing environment, the president appears to have plans to partially privatize some state-owned assets, and he says that they will have to tighten their belts for a few months, according to Kenya's Treasury Secretary Njuguna Ndugu, who has led efforts to shore up government finances. Last month, the president signed a controversial finance bill, as I earlier mentioned, that introduced new taxes, including levies on fuel and housing, which have now been frozen by the courts. Now, the opposition leader, as I mentioned earlier, uh, who's also a former prime minister, Raila Odinga, has called on Kenyans to embrace tax boycotts, with protests that began on Friday and resumed yesterday. More than a dozen people have died after clashes with police, according to the Kenyan Human Rights Commission. And Odinga, who lost last year's election to Ruto, has led demonstrations against a government he accuses of failing to help households after an inflationary surge, partly driven, some argue, by the war in Ukraine. However, the Kenyan official treasury, is quoted as saying that he doesn't know what kind of magic people expect one has to do to recover when they are persistent shocks. Now, the IMF managing director, Kristalina Georgieva, said on a visit to Nairobi in May that African countries faced tough headwinds. She's quoted as saying that the continent is being squeezed by high interest rates as well as dollar appreciation, she said. With at least 19 of the 35 nations in sub-Saharan Africa at or near debt distress. Now, Kenya is classified by the IMF as being at high risk of debt distress, and although its debt was sustainable, Georgieva, who is the IMF chief, added that the country finds itself cut off from international markets, quote unquote. Until a deal was reached with Zambia in June, China was generally reluctant to extend maturities of loans to sovereign African countries. The president, whose government faces an annual debt service bill from Beijing of about $1 billion US, has vowed to have a conversation, quote unquote, this year with his Chinese counterpart, Xi Jinping. However, with about half of Kenya's total public debt being external, estimated at 32.2% of gross domestic product, the exposure to foreign currency risk remains high, according to the World Bank warning last month. Now, the Nairobi think tank Institute of Economic Affairs say dollar-denominated repayments cost around 25% more in March than at the start of 2021 because of the shilling's decline. Now, the shilling being Kenya's currency, which is also used in neighboring countries like Tanzania and Uganda. However, they don't share the same currency, they just share the same name. A shilling, which was inherited after independence from the colonial rulers, Britain. Now, the president has shrugged off currency wars and vowed to avoid a debt default. An official, an advisor, is quoted as saying default is not an option, quote unquote. He goes on to say, or reported to say, that he didn't think they were anywhere close to the vulnerability of Ghana and Zambia, and went on to assert that if push came to shove, Kenya could pay the 2024 Eurobond maturity with its 7.5 billion of foreign reserves, US dollars, that is. Now, observers say that multilateral lenders are waiting to continue extending credit to Kenya, which is seen as one of Africa's more prominent pro-business hubs, as long as it continues its fiscal consolidation, complete reforms, and increases in revenue collection that should be sufficient. The IMF chief supported Kenya very strongly, quote unquote, as the country was acting responsibly in the face of external shocks, including severe drought. The president is quoted as saying that his emphasis is to raise resources locally rather than borrow, when he was in Paris last month. However, concerns persist despite the country's assurances, and in May, the credit agency Moody cut Kenya's credit ratings one notch, citing what they termed as an increase in government's liquidity risks, quote unquote. They further added, that is Moody, the credit reference agency, that domestic funding conditions have deteriorated considerably, quote unquote, and the agency placed Kenya on review for a downgrade, noting its constrained external financing options, a term that was used to classify or describe Kenya's situation. Now, the IA Kenya's chief executive said they are trying to manage that very consciously, but he thinks it's the strongest possibility of a default in any time in the last 10 years. And so that's really the sort of background of what's going on in Kenya with protests and economic uncertainty, increased taxes, and cutting of subsidies, which the courts, with signing of the bill, that the courts have put on hold for now. And of course, we also know how volatile the country is at the moment. But I think it also brings in question the compatibility of some of the policies and restructuring of the World Bank and IMF on African countries, especially with just countries emerging from a lockdown, Kenya relying on tourist dollar, which obviously was impacted during the lockdown, and the double shock to the citizens of both having subsidies cut and at the same time introducing taxes, new taxes, and aggressive tax collection. Now, obviously, the government has a serious debt issue resurfacing, and there's a dilemma. But I think what other observers note is that the issue has to be dealt with sensitivity, taking into account the day-to-day living conditions of the ordinary men and women in the country, notwithstanding the debt servicing. And so that is sort of, in a nutshell, what's going on in Kenya, where we have an intersection of the new bill, the legal system that has essentially intervening in putting a freeze on the bill that was signed into law by the president, whilst at the same time there appears to be pressure, international pressure and credit ratings to manage the situation and service the debt and stay within what are regarded as international standards. But whether or not those compatible and applicable to the local situation and are beneficial to the local man and woman, at least in the short term, in terms of their living conditions, is a matter for observers to make a judgment on. And so there we shall leave it on this episode of the Diary of a Lawyer. Thanks for listening, and we shall speak again. Thank you. Bye.